I think we're going to begin. On behalf of the King's University, I'd like to welcome all of you to our special event this afternoon, which is co-hosted by the Gateway Center for Israel. Nick Lessmeister is the director of the Gateway Center, and he'll join us a little later for the Q&A. My name is David Rudolph, and I oversee the Messianic Jewish Studies program here at the King's University. Our program is accredited. We offer degrees and concentrations in Messianic Jewish Studies on the undergraduate, the graduate, and the doctoral level. We will also, this is news to most of you, I think, we will also be rolling out a new concentration on anti-Semitism and Jewish advocacy this coming fall. If these are areas that excite you and you'd like to know more about our program, we're including a link in the chat box that you can click to get more information. The mission of our program is twofold. First, to train rabbis and teachers in the Messianic Jewish community. And the second is to train Christian leaders who are called to be bridges between the church and the Jewish people. As an expression of our twofold mission as a program, we hold annual lectures on subjects related to the New Testament and Second Temple Judaism, Jewish-Christian relations, and Messianic Judaism. Today, we have the privilege of having with us a senior New Testament scholar. Dr. Craig Keener is the F.M. and Ada Thompson Professor of Biblical Studies at Asbury Theological Seminary. He has written more than 30 books, including at least 2 major commentaries on the Gospel of Matthew, both of which I have in my library and I reference regularly. He is president of the Evangelical Theological Society, and it warms my heart to say that he has been a close friend of the Messianic Jewish community for decades. In this webinar, Dr. Keener is going to discuss the Jewish context of the Gospel of Matthew. He will share with us for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about another 40 minutes for Q&A. So please be sure to send us your questions. Well, without further ado, Dr. Keener.
It's great to be with you all. It would have been great to be with you in person, although I'm glad I don't have to fly right now. I should make one correction. The ETS, Evangelical Theological Society presidency, that's for 1 year, and that's already done. Can you see me and hear me? Because my screen is such, I just want to make sure I'm still, okay, good. So I'm going to screen share. We're going to the Gospel of Matthew, or Madat Yahu, in its Jewish context. The problem is they've given me 40 minutes to do this. And, you know, the whole gospel, well, all the gospels obviously have Jewish context because what they're describing took place in Judea and Galilee. But yeah, to do it with Matthew, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gospel of John, Yochanan, is you know, it fits the Dead Sea Scrolls type Jewish background very well. If you look at rabbinic literature, which comes after, you know, it's all written down after the Gospel of Matthew, but Matthew is kind of rabbinic. It's like what you might say of a scribe for the kingdom who brings forth out of his treasure things both old and new. So if we wanted to do all of the Jewish context of Matthew, all 1,060 some verses of it, in 40 minutes, 45 minutes, you're asking a lot. So I'm going to go as far as I can with as much as I can, and then just maybe give me a 5-minute warning, although I'm going to try not to notice on my own watch, and then just stop me when you have to butt in. But We could start with the genealogy, but that's kind of too obvious. I mean, you've got Israel's history kind of summarized there. Abraham, David, the exile. I have a friend who just published on some more, the 14 generations, 14 being also the number of David's name in Hebrew. And I wasn't quite sure what I thought about that, but now he's found a whole bunch of other patterns that work in Hebrew in the genealogy that have gotten my attention. But anyway, you've got 4 women in the genealogy: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Mrs. Uriah, that shows us some Gentile background to David's heritage, the mother of King Solomon. Not that Bathsheba was well, she probably was a Judahite, but but having been married to Uriah the Hittite, that shows that, yeah, there's a place for Gentiles in the kingdom, kind of warming up for where the gospel is going to go in its conclusion. But most of that is fairly obvious. Most people already recognize that. But something that people often don't recognize, and then I'll get on from the genealogy because I can't spend much time on that, but there are a couple of midrashic adjustments that are not noted in English translations. The translators thought these were probably ancient equivalent of typos, but at the proper place in the genealogy for King Asa, it doesn't say Asa. There's 1 letter difference, the Greek letter phi, it's Asaph. Well, who was Asaph? Asaph was a psalmist. And instead of the wicked king Ammon, who reigned for 2 years, 1 letter difference, it's Amos. Well, who was Amos? Amos was a prophet. And so by these small orthographic changes, the kind that the rabbis like to play with, Matthew reminds us that Jesus is not only heir of the royal dynasty of the kingdom of Judah, but he's also the heir of the Psalms and the prophets. He's the fulfillment of what God had spoken. Now, in chapter 2, we come to the Magi, who repeatedly appear in ancient literature as a cast of Eastern, Persian, or Babylonian wise men. And the Greek term appears in Greek translations of Daniel for Daniel's enemies. Negatively, the term was sometimes applied to magicians. So you don't get the impression off the bat that these are going to be good guys. And yet 3 times it says that they came to worship the King of the Jews. And they contrast here with somebody else who claims to be King of the Jews. He's actually an Idumean. Idumeans had been force converted over a century earlier, but the Idumeans, well, at least in Herod's case, he wasn't entirely Orthodox. He was building temples for other gods in other places, but he built a nice one for the God of Israel in Jerusalem. Well, would he listen to the Magi? Would he listen to astrologers? Astrology was considered the science of the day. And of course, in the Tanakh, it's forbidden, but in early Jewish thought, some were making kind of peace with the ideas around them. Some sources portray Abraham as the founder of astrology, which is really strange. But generally, when Jewish thinkers talked about astrology, they said, okay, maybe it rules the nations, but it didn't rule Israel. And it maybe had predictive value, but that only. And rulers were very paranoid when it came to things like comets, which were thought to signal the downfall of a ruler. And sometimes they ended up banishing astrologers and so on. So this is a picture of a zodiac from 6th century, a 6th century Galilean synagogue with Helios, the sun god, in the middle. Of course, they didn't believe he was a god. They just were using the pictures. But just to say there was a little bit of syncretism, not so much in the 1st century as this, but even in the 1st century, you have Josephus and Philo comparing things in the temple with the zodiac. So would Herod have listened to the astrologers? Well, given Herod's building of temples elsewhere, he probably would have. And we have this contrast between him and them. Bethlehem was just 6 miles from Jerusalem. And It was within view of the Herodium, another palace of Herod's. So he could have had soldiers already on duty there. A caravan this size wouldn't simply disappear. They'd normally take the road north from Bethlehem back through Jerusalem, back to the east. So he's expecting they're going to have to come back through Jerusalem, and he wants a report. And of course, they don't give it. I'm going to give a little bit more background on Herod. Uh, just it helps us understand some of the diversity of thought within Judaism at this time. When Rome began to expand, some Judean factions sought Rome's help against other Judean factions. You had two sons, both of whom wanted to be rulers, and each of whom sought Rome's help in putting them in power. And there's a danger of dividing among ourselves. Eventually, Rome helped one side win, but of course, that meant that Rome was their patron and Rome was in power. Well, Rome helped Antipater, Herod the Great's father, and Rome also helped Herod the Great to be in power. If you wonder why the Sanhedrin acts the way it does sometimes in the Gospels, the Sanhedrin is just a word for a senate or a municipal assembly. The Great Bet Din in this case, these were the ruling authorities, the ruling families of Jerusalem and Judea. Well, they weren't very happy with Herod the Great. And Herod the Great, being a super efficient politician, resolved that by executing them and putting in power his own political lackeys. So by the time you get to their role in the Gospels, keep in mind that these are mostly the families that were put in power by Herod the Great. And they were probably dominated especially by Sadducees, by aristocratic priests. Pharisees had more power a couple centuries before under Salome Alexandria, but they didn't have much political power here, even though they were more popular with the people than the Sadducees. Herod's political instincts were usually excellent. Unfortunately, he was friends with Antony, but enemies of Cleopatra. And if you're like, try to be friends with me, but you're enemies with my wife, that's not going to go over too well. Caesar conquered them both, and Herod came to Caesar, Octavian Augustus, and said, I was a loyal friend to your enemy until he died. And so you see what a loyal friend I can be. And now I volunteer to be your friend. And guess what? Caesar said, okay, I'll take you. And Herod repaid him, building a great temple in honor of Caesar in the ancient city of Samaria, which he renamed Sebast. Sebast is basically Greek for Augustus town. And he built other temples in honor of Caesar elsewhere. But in Jerusalem, he began especially the greatest temple of the ancient world for the true God. If there hadn't been so much anti-Judaism in the ancient world, it wouldn't have been the temple of Artemis of Ephesus that became one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It would have been the temple in Jerusalem. That was the most massive and magnificent temple in the ancient world. But he wanted to decorate it in ways that showed his loyalty to Rome. So he had a golden eagle put in the front of the temple. And a couple Pharisaic teachers taught their disciples that's not right. And 40 or 50 of them went and tried to take down the golden eagle. And so Herod had them executed along with their teachers. I don't know why they always hold us responsible for what our students do, but be careful what you do after you hear my teaching. Herod was even political about some of his many marriages. Herod married Mariamne, a Maccabean princess, who would validate him with the people. Now, the Maccabees were a line of priest kings who had helped liberate Judea from the rule of the Seleucid dynasty in Syria. But technically, you weren't supposed to have priests be kings. You had a division of powers, separation of powers. You had the Davidic line and you had the priestly line. And plus the priestly line was supposed to be Zadokite. Anyway, so some people weren't happy with the Maccabees, but most of the people really still thought fondly of the Maccabean dynasty. And when he married Mariamne, that was a political coup. She was even his favorite wife. Unfortunately, somebody accused her of adultery, And you can imagine what happened given who Herod was. Um, Disregarding politics for once, he had her strangled to death, later discovered her innocence and felt badly, so he named a tower in his palace after her, 3 towers, Hippicus, Phaesial, and Mariamne. He disliked competition, but Mariamne's kid brother, the high priest, was getting too popular. So he had a drowning accident in a pool that turns out to, archaeology shows, was only about 3 feet deep. Maybe he was extremely short. In any case, Herod was insanely jealous. Nobody could become king except him. He heard that 2 of his sons were plotting to take his throne, so he executed them. Later on, found out that they were innocent. You think you came from a dysfunctional family. By the way, Joseph came from a dysfunctional family in Genesis. God used him greatly, so God can use us whatever kind of families we come from. But it turned out that another son actually was plotting against Herod, so Herod hadn't killed, even though Herod was on his deathbed and kicked the bucket about 6 days later. Herod cared deeply about his reputation, and he wanted people to mourn when he died. So he ordered a bunch of nobles arrested who would then be executed when he died, so that there would be mourning in the land when Herod died. But his sister-in-law set them free when he died, and there was rejoicing in the land. I'm going to skip some of this, but just to say, when we read how Herod acts in Matthew chapter 2, killing the male children of Bethlehem, I mean, here you have these magi who are pagan astrologers. And in this case, God chooses to reveal himself to these pagan astrologers. It may have been one off, but it shows how gracious God is. But meanwhile, Herod, this Idumean king, claims to be king of the Jews, acts like a pagan king, like Pharaoh of old, or like Antiochus Epiphanes, killing the male children of God's people. So again, for the sake of time, I have too many notes here, but let's look at how he handles, how Matthew handles scripture. So you have, I skipped this for the sake of time, but I kind of wish I hadn't. But the virgin birth in Matthew 1:23, God is with us. When he cites Isaiah 7:14, in the context, the immediate context, the short-term sign in Isaiah would have been Isaiah's own son, but his sons, as he says in Isaiah chapter 8, were for signs and wonders to the house of Israel. And you go on a little further and you find out what it's a sign for. Unto us is born, sorry, I'm mixing it with Luke, but to us is born one who's going to be the mighty God, as well as a ruler from the house of David in Isaiah chapter 9. Well, you come to Matthew chapter 2, and he quotes Hosea 11:1. Now, in the context of Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I called my son is talking about Israel's exodus from Egypt. It's not really about the Messiah per se, it's about Israel and the exodus. So why does Matthew apply it to Yeshua, to Jesus? Is he ignoring the context? But he actually knows the Hebrew pretty well. I mean, he's giving his own translation of it. He also knows the rest of the context. Hosea 11 uses that first exodus as a foretaste of a future exodus, a new era of salvation. And he's finding a pattern between Yeshua and the history of Israel. And he does that again elsewhere early on in this narrative. Israel's in the wilderness 40 years. Yeshua's in the wilderness 40 days. Israel was tempted in the wilderness. Yeshua was tempted in the wilderness. God gave Israel commands in Deuteronomy. Yeshua quotes 3 commands from Deuteronomy, and so on. So you see this parallel running through. Just like in Isaiah, you have the servant, Israel, and then you have one who suffers on behalf of the servant, one within Israel who epitomizes God's people and brings deliverance to them and a light to the nations. So the Tanakh itself suggests such analogies between the leader of God's people and God's people himself. And so moving on, because I'm only like not even 1/7 of the way through Yahoo. But Yeshua's message is summarized in chapter 4 and verse 17. And it's not a completely new message, because the same message is summarized for Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist in chapter 3 and verse 2. But repent in light of the coming kingdom. Repent means turn. It's the language often in the prophets calling God's people to turn back to the Torah, turn back to God's ways. And what it's saying is get ready for the promised era of restoration. And it has very much to do with, what we call the gospel, the good news. That's rooted, you have that a number of times in Isaiah, Ishayahu. You have it, for example, in Isaiah 40, where there's a voice of one crying in the wilderness, and this voice is going to be announcing good news. Well, here, the language especially echoes, because when he speaks of the good news of the kingdom, especially echoes Isaiah 52:7. How beautiful in the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace. So it's good news of peace, who brings good news, who announces, and in the Septuagint, the Greek translation, announcing is, again, using a word having to do with good news, who announces salvation. It's good news of salvation. Who says to Zion, your God reigns. That is the kingdom or the reign of God. God was going to be leading his people back in a new exodus and restoring his people. And so this is good news of restoration. Yochanan was proclaiming that, saying, get ready for this. And Yeshua is proclaiming that and saying, get ready for this. Now, where does this climax as we read the Gospels? It climaxes in the mission of Yeshua. And we could spend a long time on that. But as often in the Tanakh, God does things in phases. So he promises a restoration, and Judahites come back to the land, but it's not a full restoration yet. The desert hasn't blossomed with lilies, Dead Sea hasn't come to life, and so on. It falls short of some of the expectations, but that's because God is doing things in phases. And so with the first coming of the Messiah, we have another phase. And that phase inaugurates or brings in God's reign in a special way, preparing for a future phase. And in that future phase, God completes the restoration of his people. But we already have the foretaste now. And all through the Brit Hadashah, as we call it, the New Testament, which isn't really a testament, but I'm digressing too much. I'm ADHD. Have you noticed that? I'm digressing again. So in any case, throughout there, we see that we already have the down payment or the first installment, the foretaste of that future promise. It's like throughout the prophets, one of the signs of the restoration time would be that God would pour out his Ruach HaKodesh on his people. Joel chapter 3 or 228, if you're reading it in English, in Isaiah 42, Isaiah 44, Isaiah 61, Ezekiel 36, Ezekiel 37, Ezekiel 39, God would pour out his Ruach HaKodesh on his people, probably Zechariah 14 as well. Anyway, and so that has already happened, and the coming of the Messiah has already happened. What people weren't expecting, they weren't expecting necessarily the phases, but you don't see those until they unfold. That's the way prophetic literature worked. But also what people weren't expecting. I mean, they were expecting, okay, the servant suffers. Somebody may suffer on behalf of the servant. That wasn't all quite clear in people's minds. And then the Lord himself would come and redeem his people and lead them forth back to Zion. And then also you had the expectation of the Davidic Messiah. You had all these different expectations, the Son of Man in Daniel 7, 13 and 14. But what people didn't recognize until it happened was that all these were happening in the same person, that God himself had come to restore his people. So we have 5 main discourses that flesh out the summary of 417, that show us what it looks like for the kingdom to be the kingdom. Uh, gives us the ethics of the kingdom, and very similar to Pharisaic ethics on many points. Not completely. They're, well, Shemites and Hillelites among the Pharisees debated among themselves, and sometimes Yeshua stakes out a position vis-a-vis one or the other of them. But the proclamation of God's kingdom, parables about the presence of God's kingdom, and then relationships in God's kingdom in chapter 18, and then the future kingdom and judgment on the unrepentant religious establishments. Now, from the standpoint of when Yeshua was speaking, this was all future. From the standpoint, I think, of when Mattatyahu is writing, at least his final draft, maybe part of this has already been fulfilled, namely the judgment on the religious establishment of his day, the Sadducean priestly establishment, and so on, the destruction of the temple. But Yeshua warns at his second coming, when he's going to come back, the next phase, that there's going to be judgment on unrepentant religious establishments in that time too. And there he talks about people who profess to be his own followers. The lessons he's giving are not ethnic specific. They have to do with all those who claim to be followers of God or followers of Yeshua, that we better be the real thing, which some of the Sadducees weren't, and some people who claim to be Yeshua's followers aren't really either, exploiting the sheep and so on. Yeshua's teachings, the form of these would be mostly familiar. So sayings of a sage, like what you have in Proverbs, parables, very similar to the parables we have in the rabbis, and actually very similar to the parables we have, like one by Nathan and one in Isaiah chapter 5, and so on in the Tanakh itself. Uses familiar forms, prophesies, gives woes, sometimes gets into midrashic debates. So very, very similar. Many characteristics of his teaching are similar to the characteristics of other Jewish sages, and some are more distinctive. Amen, I say to you. That's translated a bunch of different ways. Truly, I say to you. But that is distinctive for Yeshua's authority. I mean, normally you end a prayer with Amen. You don't preface a saying with it. But parables and proverbs, those were common. Unlike many other rabbis, Yeshua doesn't go around citing earlier tradition, like, Akiba says, Yochanan ben Zakkai says, that Hillel says, that Shemaiah and Abtalion, he didn't do that. He would sometimes say, I say to you, which some other rabbis did, but I mean, Yeshua does that more consistently. Hyperbole, rhetorical overstatement, that was common among rabbis. It was common for grabbing hearers' attention. So was humor. The Talmud is full of laughs. If you, well, certain parts of it are really funny if you follow, especially some of the Haggadic stuff. I love it. But anyway, but then there's some other things that are very different. I mean, other rabbis didn't go around hinting they were divine, like Matthew 18:20, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in their midst. Well, there was a familiar Jewish saying where 2 or 3 are gathered for the study of the Torah. There is God's Shekinah, his presence among them. That wasn't, other rabbis didn't say that about themselves, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. They would say it about the Torah. And actually, they spoke only of God as omnipresent. Sometimes they called him Makom, the place, meaning the omnipresent one. You have other graphic images, though. I mean, other rabbis could use very graphic images to hold people's attention. They didn't have PowerPoint, they didn't have videos, they didn't have Zoom. So you had to rhetorically hold people's attention with graphic, vivid images. Yeshua gives Beatitudes, very common way of expressing things, both in the Tanakh and in early Jewish literature. Uh, he gives these, he says, this is what the kingdom is like. These are the people for whom the kingdom comes, not like the powerful, the elite, the high priestly establishment who were, Josephus tells us they were involved in a lot of corruption. Um, one of them actually took a payment from the governor to assassinate another one. Dead Sea Scrolls don't like them. Um, Later rabbis don't like them. I mean, it's not just some people say, "Oh, your Gospels, they're down on the high priestly elite." Actually, so is just about everybody else whose record survives in terms of the rich priests were oppressing the poor priests and doing stuff like that. So it's the issue was it was the elite who were abusing power. Power corrupts, or as the Talmud says, power buries those who wield it. In any case, uh, Yeshua says the kingdom is for the meek, for the gentle, for the poor in spirit, for the peacemakers, and so on. And he says, "You are the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world." That last one comes from Isaiah, but this is your identity. This is what you are. But we need to live by uh, those beatitudes. So the kingdom is not just about our behavior, but about our character. It's what one is, not just what one does. Disciples of the kingdom who don't live like disciples of the kingdom are like tasteless salt or invisible light. And he wasn't thinking of the value of infrared or ultraviolet light. Remember, this is the 1st century. So anyway, tasteless salt. Well, what would tasteless salt be like? I mean, what do you do with salt that loses its saltiness? Somebody later asked Rabbi Tarfon, maybe somewhere around the year 90. Tarfon's a sad case. Later in rabbinic literature, he goes around. He was known for saying, if I'm not right on this, may I bury my sons. And I don't know if it's actually true that he buried his sons, but later rabbis may have just inferred that because he went around saying that and he buried his sons. But anyway, Rabbi Tarfon, somebody asked him, "So, what do you do with salt that loses its saltiness?" He said, "You salt it with the afterbirth of a mule." Now, if you know much about mules, mules are the cross between a horse and a donkey. Mules are sterile, and therefore mules can't have babies. Mules don't have afterbirth. And Rabbi Tarfon was saying, you ask a stupid question, you get a stupid answer. Salt doesn't lose its saltiness. But if it did, what are you going to do? Salt it again? No, it's worthless. Throw it out. Disciples who aren't really disciples are worth about as much as tasteless salt or invisible light. And stronger words follow in verses 17 through 20. You must observe God's Torah. Now, Yeshua is going to interpret it in a different way than many of his contemporaries did. So, many teachers in the Pharisaic tradition, actually, it's not limited to the Pharisaic tradition. You probably have this in the letter of Aristeas in diaspora Judaism, an implication of it. But the idea of building a fence around the Torah to make sure we don't accidentally break the Torah will be a little bit stricter. We'll define the boundaries more explicitly, more clearly. And so when you're going to do that, you have to think like a good lawyer and figure out, okay, is it kosher to eat an egg that a chicken laid on the Sabbath? That the kind of pill pull, that they could discuss. But Yeshua is going to strengthen the law, strengthen the Torah in another way. He's going to go for the heart of the Torah. So stronger words follow. He says in 5:17, I didn't come to undo the law. I came to fulfill it. And then he says in 5:18, not a single yod will pass away from the Torah until all of it is fulfilled. And then he talks about keeping the least commandment makes you greatest in the kingdom. Breaking it makes you least in the kingdom. And your righteousness must surpass that. of the scribes and the Pharisees. So if the Pharisees fasted twice a week, at least during dry season, does that mean we have to fast 3 days a week? Please, no. Anyway, when he says not the smallest yod will or the smallest stroke will pass away from the Torah. There was a familiar saying back then, or a familiar story back then, where if you remember, Sarai's name is changed to Sarah in Genesis 17. Well, the Hebrew letter yod is taken out of her name. And the rabbi said that this yod cried out to God from one generation to another, saying, God, you've taken me out of the Torah. When are you going to put me back in the Torah? How many of you think this is a true story? I don't think the rabbis probably thought it was a true story either, but I mentioned, there's humor, there's hyperbole. So anyway, this yod is crying out, God, when are you going to put me back in the Torah? And finally, in the book of Numbers, Hoshea's name is changed to Yehoshua, Joshua. He gets a yod stuck in his name. And the rabbi said, see, not a single yod can pass from God's word. Another story was that a yod was crying out to God, God, King Shlomo, King Solomon is trying to uproot me from the Bible, to which God responded, not a single yod will pass from my word. 1,000 Solomons shall be uprooted, but not a single yod will be. And so Yeshua is emphasizing God's word is true. It stands forever. This is both in Matthew and Luke. So at least on the usual configuration of the Gospels, this is like clearly goes back really early memories of Jesus' teachings. The least commandment. If you break it, you're least in the kingdom. You keep it, you're greatest. What happens if you break it and you keep it on the same day? I don't think this was meant to be calculated like a math competition or something. I mean, it's like, again, the use of hyperbole and the use of superlatives. So one rabbi in the Talmud comes in one day and says, this student over here is so brilliant that if he were in one scale of the balance and the whole world were in the other scale, he would outweigh the entire rest of the world. And I'm using he because the rabbis back then it was he, but today it could be he or she. But anyway, then he comes in the next day and says to another student, if this my student he's so brilliant, if he were in one scale of the balance and the whole world were in the other scale, he would outweigh the whole rest of the world. Now, what happened? Was there a brain transplant overnight or what? Rather, it's a hyperbolic way of communicating the point. This student is so brilliant, and this student is so brilliant, praising their students. So least commandment, greatest commandment. You keep it, you're greatest in the kingdom, you break it, you're least. Now, some rabbis actually tried to figure out which were a lot of them tried to figure out which was the greatest commandment. And the most common view, Rabbi Akiba actually came close to Yeshua. He said, love your neighbor as yourself is the greatest. But what seems to be the most common view, it's also attested in the first century in Josephus, the greatest commandment was honor your father and your mother, and honor your mother and your father. They noted it was in both orders, and so honor them equally. But do this and you will live. They said that's the greatest commandment. And some said, okay, what's the least commandment? That's the one from Deuteronomy 22. When you come to a bird's nest and you take out the young, leave the mother behind. And they said, okay, that's the least commandment. But it says in Deuteronomy 22, do this and what? You will live. And they said, aha, you see, it's the same reward or the same punishment for the least commandment as for the greatest commandment. What was this saying? Well, the rabbis admitted that everybody sins sometimes, even them. I mean, they might make an exception for Enoch or Abraham once in a while, but normally they'd say everybody sinned. I mean, again, a story about Rabbi Akiba, Satan appeared to him as a beautiful woman and ran up a palm tree, and Akiba is climbing up the palm tree after him, and then Satan reveals himself as Satan and says, if you were not the pious Rabbi Akiba, I would kick you to your death. Probably, again, not a true story, but meant to illustrate that everybody sins. not to encourage anybody to sin, by the way. There were all sorts of other things about that. Um, honoring honoring God's name was, the Kadush Hashem. That's one of the most important things ever. But anyway, their point was not that, you will have to be perfect to enter the kingdom. Their point was, you can't pick and choose among God's commandments. You can't say, well, I won't murder, but I'll sleep with somebody other than my spouse. You have to obey all of God's Torah. You must be more righteous than the Pharisees. Well, how? In what sense does he say this? Yeshua goes on to say, he quotes the Tanakh 6 times, and then he says, okay, it means more than what you think it means. It actually goes to the heart of this. This is his sort of fence around the Torah. He goes to the heart of it. So the Torah says you shall not kill. Yeshua says you shall not want to kill. The Torah says you shall not commit adultery. Yeshua says you shall not want to commit adultery or betray your spouse by unfaithful divorce. The Torah limits sin, but Yeshua came to bring God's reign and deliver us from the power of sin. Rabbis, and actually this is before the rabbis, you see about the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, talks about that also in the Dead Sea Scrolls and elsewhere. But they spoke of how we're born with an evil impulse, and they believed that through studying the Torah, you could get more power to overcome the evil impulse. And actually, diaspora Jews talked about this too. Fourth Maccabees, Philo of Alexandria, they talked about how the Torah gives you reason, which empowers you to overcome passions. Well, Yeshua came to deliver us from sin, to make us a foretaste of the new creation. Well, I'm running out of time. Yeshua summarizes, just in case you think my examples are meant to be comprehensive, just be perfect as your Heavenly Father is, which means we all have some room to grow. But anyway, I would love to go into some of the details on this. Well, let me do this one at least, where he says, you shall not commit adultery. Don't desire to commit adultery. Don't look upon a woman, and the principle, of course, is the same, don't look upon a man, to lust after them, to covet them sexually. A lot of Gentiles thought, oh, that's a good thing. What's wrong with that? I've met some people today like that. Women in the Eastern Mediterranean and further east, the more was covered, but and especially conservative families in Judah and Galilee, women would wear head coverings because hair was a prime object of male lust. If they were married, they'd wear head coverings so nobody would lust after them. I don't have to worry about covering my head. I really like if I can wear a kippah because you don't see my bald spot so well. But anyway, Yeshua says, if this is so important that if you are tempted to lust, rip your eye out. Most of us understand that's hyperbole, but the point is, don't let anything keep you from God. God's reign is more important than anything. Now, there was a time when I was attending a synagogue. I've attended different synagogues. This was a Reform synagogue, as you can probably guess from what I'm about to say. But the very nice rabbi, but he was explaining during his exposition in very gentle terms the differences, as he saw it, between Judaism and Christianity. He said, now, Christians are against lust, but Jews recognize that there's nothing wrong with little good, healthy lust. I think he was probably thinking in terms of the Yetzer Hara and how we need some passion to procreate, for example. But I pointed out to him afterwards, actually, you've got ancient Jewish tradition anyway. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls condemn lust. Testaments of the 12 patriarchs, which are later, condemn lust. The rabbis, I mean, the school of Rabbi Ishmael in the 2nd century said that a person who stimulates themselves sexually is like somebody who commits adultery. That sounds pretty close to what Yeshua said. But I said, even if you don't count any of that, what about the 10 commandments? I mean, the 7th of the 10 commandments says, don't commit adultery. The 10th of the 10 commandments, though, says, you shall not covet your neighbor's, and including among that is, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Hey, and actually the Greek translation of that in the Septuagint uses exactly the same word that Matthew uses in Matthew 5:28. Don't covet your neighbor's spouse, or for that matter, your neighbor's future spouse, and so on. So I'd like to go into what he says about divorce and how that relates to schools of Hillel and Shammai and so on. But I know I'm really at the end of my time. So, but you can always ask, and then I get to answer the question, or try to. But if you ask me any hard questions, I should point out to you that my PhD is from Duke, but David Rudolph has a PhD from Cambridge, and really the hard questions go to him. David, I think we can come back to you now.
Well, Dr. Keener, that is, Craig, we're so grateful to have you here. We were having a little chat while you were teaching, and we felt that we wanted to give you 10 more minutes because we could see, that you were about to go into some really wonderful teaching. I think you were heading more maybe toward discussing divorce issue. Maybe you could, give us another 10 minutes and then we'll
Sure.
break for Q&A.
Thanks. Okay, thanks. And those of you who don't want the 10 minutes, you can, maybe you have something on your iPhone you can look at while you're waiting for me to finish. So coming back to Matthew chapter 5, don't betray your spouse by divorce. Yeshua warns that whoever remarries commits adultery. Now I'm gonna make a mess first. I'm gonna clean it up. So don't go check your Facebook just because of what I just said. But anyway, if this is literal, all remarriages are adulterous, and therefore pastoral responsibilities would include breaking up second, third, fourth, whatever marriages. Ooh, that would make it really hard to be a pastor or a rabbi, right? But here's what Yeshua says in Mark, which most of us, there's just a debate on this, but most of us think that Matthew incorporates Mark's material. Mark got this. Many of us think, and I'm writing a commentary on Mark now, many of us think that Mark actually got his material, most of his material from Shimon Cephas, from Simon Peter. So anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. Notice the against her. So it's not just an arbitrary point. It's like he's defending somebody who can be wronged. A wife could be divorced for almost any reason and had little economic recourse once divorced, at least in certain circles. We know that, I mean, that Philo talks about it. Actually, the book of Sirach, it's from before the time of Yeshua's birth. The book of Sirach says, if your wife doesn't go as your hand commands, cut her off, divorce her. The get doesn't mean, okay, I'm through with you, now get. Get was Hebrew for certificate of divorce. It was a good thing because it gave her the legal right to remarry. But what were the grounds for divorce? Well, the Pharisees debated this. Not everybody debated it, but the Pharisees debated it. And the two schools of Pharisees held different positions on this. Often you find Jesus is closer to the Hillelites, but in this case, he's going to be closer to the Shammaites. Those are the two schools of Pharisaic thought. The Shammaites looked at Deuteronomy 24 and said, a man can divorce his wife for any cause of uncleanness. And they interpreted that as unfaithfulness. So if she is, and I'm sorry that neither group said that the wife could divorce her husband. because they didn't get that in Deuteronomy 24. And anyway, Mark deals with that too. But anyway, for both, and so does Paul. But the Shemites said that a man could divorce his wife for if she was unfaithful, which means if she committed adultery, or even if she couldn't get anybody to do it with her, but she wanted somebody to do it with her. She tried to get somebody to do. So she goes out in public with nude hair, with her head uncovered. Can you imagine that? And again, most of them didn't have hair like mine. But the Hillelites, and they were speaking kind of hyperbolically on this, but they said he can divorce his wife for any cause of uncleanness, that is, anything at all, which was probably the common practice, like it commonly is today with both genders. So they said, if she burns the toast, and Rabbi Akiba later on, whom I keep quoting, Rabbi Akiba said, if he finds someone more beautiful, we also find Akiba saying a lot of stuff about makeup and cosmetics. I don't know if he had invested in that industry, but anyway, the Hillelites and the Shemites differed on this. And you can see where Yeshua comes down on it. But keep in mind, even with the Hillelites, the consensus among the rabbis was that even the very altar of God weeps tears over divorce. They weren't recommending divorce. It was said that one wife who was being divorced by her husband, she came and she begged the rabbis to help her. And they said, we're sorry, we sympathize with you, but it's his right legally. But they also told another story. I don't know if I should be telling you all these stories, but the Haggadah is so, I love it. There was a couple, they'd been married for 10 years. They hadn't had any children. And so, the rabbi said, you have to be fruitful and multiply. So, and this is attested also in Pseudo-Philo's Biblical Antiquities. So it's not limited to the rabbis, but if you couldn't have children, you had to marry somebody else and try it again. So the husband is very sad, but he says to his wife, okay, I'm going to give you whatever is most precious to you in this house. When you go back to your father's house, you can take it with you. She said, okay, let me throw you a party. She got that from Esther, Hadassah. She threw a party for him, got him good and drunk, and had her brothers carry him to her father's house. When he woke up, he said, I can't divorce you. Oh. And so they went to the rabbi again, and the rabbi said, okay, I'll pray. And he prayed for him, and they had a baby. And I don't know if they lived happily ever after, but it's a nice ending to the story. But divorce was a sad thing. But when Yeshua says no remarriage, is he being literal or is he using hyperbole? Remember, the rabbis often used hyperbole. The context of the divorce saying in Matthew 5:32 is hyperbole. Remember, the solution for lusting is tearing out your eyeballs, or whichever one is causing you to lust. Yeshua's other teachings also assume the dissolubility of marriage. And when I say dissolubility here, I don't mean the moral dissolubility. I don't mean like it's okay to just divorce somebody, but rather that you're not still married to the person ontologically. So the woman at the well, the exception clause, Rab Shaul, Paul recognizes an exception, and the very context in the passage we started with. So Yeshua often uses hyperbole. Camel through the eye of a needle was actually a common hyperbole for doing the very impossible. Moving mountains was also a Jewish hyperbole for doing the impossible. The context of the divorce saying in Matthew 5:32 is hyperbole. Again, most of you haven't taken out your eyes, please do not do that. If you're an eye surgeon and you have to do it for somebody, that's understandable, but before you take the speck out of somebody else's eye, make sure you take the log out of your own. That also, by the way, was a familiar Jewish saying. It wasn't just Yeshua who used that one in Matthew 7. Yeshua's other teachings assume the dissolubility of marriage. It doesn't say to the woman at the well, you were married once and lived with 5 guys since then. Rather, he says you were married 5 times. You're just living with somebody now. He seems to count them as real marriages. And then the exception clause. Whoever divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unfaithfulness. So let's say this guy was unfaithful to his wife. Well, if if on the grounds of unfaithfulness, okay, she's no longer married to him, how can he be married to her? So it lets you know this has to be hyperbole if you have an exception made. And the point of the exception is you're not supposed to break your marriage. But if the other person breaks the marriage, you're not, I mean, you can't control that. So Shaul recognizes another exception. He says, Yeshua already taught us, don't divorce, don't abandon a faithful spouse. But he says, if the spouse abandons you, the believer is not under bondage. That's the language of Gittin. In ancient Jewish divorce contracts, you have it in Mishnah Gittin 9. You also have it in some that have been found from the Judean desert. So, it's, even though the Mishnah is later than the Gospels, we do have it attested earlier. The exact language for freedom to remarry was, you are not bound to this marriage, or you are not bound, you were free. Those were all ways of saying you're free to remarry. So we could go into more detail on that, but just to say, where it says, what God has joined together, let no one separate, Mark 10, Matthew 19. The point in both cases is not that it can't be dissolved, not that you're still married to the same person and therefore getting married to somebody else is adultery. That's hyperbole. The literal point is not that it can't be dissolved, but that it shouldn't be. Don't break up your marriage. Again, if your marriage is broken against your will, you do your best to hold it, but you can't force the marriage to stay together. Biblical exceptions are adultery, abandonment. I would also think that along the same lines of the same principle that Yeshua teaches and Shaul teaches, we would apply it also to abuse. But I think my 10 minutes are probably way up by now. So I really enjoyed this, and I hope I didn't open more can of more worms than I maybe I shouldn't have opened it. But anyway, so David, it's you again.
Very good. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Lesmeister, the director of Gateway Center for Israel. Nick?
Hey, thanks, David. Thank you so much, Dr. Keener, for taking our minds and pulling them apart and leaving them in a status of, this organization here so that the Lord can help us to put them back together. This is really, we are so grateful. And I know that there's some questions that have already come in. So if you're still with us here, we see we've got quite a few of you still with us. Please, this is our opportunity now for the next 28, 30 minutes to have some questions. So go ahead and submit them in the Q&A, and then we'll do our best to see how many that we can answer and that Dr. Keener can answer while we still have him here just for today. And just as a reminder, unless if some of you have to leave here, that we will be doing this again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central. Dr. Keener is going to be discussing the Jewishness of the book of Revelation. So that will also be equally as fascinating, I'm sure. So let me just jump right in. I want to give as much priority here to the attendees' questions. I'm looking at them over here. So here's a good starting one, Dr. Keener. Someone asked, David Stern's Complete Jewish Bible notes that the Magi from Matthew 2 were considered by some as Jewish who were associated with the prophet Daniel. This note holds they may have come from a Jewish school stemming from Daniel's day. Do you think this theory holds credence since they were looking for the Messiah?
I think they were Gentiles. And I think it's part of a motif that runs through Matthew's gospel, starting with the four women in the genealogy, and then the Magi, and then chapter 3, God is able to raise up for Abraham from these stones, Galilee, the Gentiles in chapter 4, chapter 8, the Gentile centurion, and also the demoniacs in the pig-eating region, and then a bunch of stuff. There's stuff in chapters 10, 11, and 12 that are consistent with this, but then and then Caesarea Philippi in 16, but especially coming back to it, the good news of the kingdom must be preached among all the nations, 24:14, and chapter 27, you've got the execution squad, Gentile execution squad, and then in 28, making disciples of all the nations. So I think he's been leading up to that the whole way through. The Magi, the term as it appears in Daniel, these are actually Daniel's enemies. They're not good guys, and they appear all over the place in literature from the early Roman Empire period for Babylonian or Persian astrologers. So not to say that there wasn't some Jewish influence from Daniel. I mean, maybe Zoroastrianism actually even had some influence from Daniel, but now I'm getting out on thin ice, so I better stop with that.
I'd like to maybe press into that a little. Matthew's gospel begins with Yeshua being described as the son of David and the son of Abraham.
Yes.
How, as son of David, it's a little bit more clear to see how he's the king of Israel. He's described as the shepherd king throughout Matthew. How do you see son of Abraham being unpacked in the gospel?
The way he's identifying with his people. So like what we saw in Hosea 11:1 in Matthew chapter 2, out of Egypt have I called my son, and how he's identifying with Israel. And even, the first quotation, of course, this only works if you know the context, but Matthew was biblical literate, and I think he takes for granted that at least his target audience is fairly biblical literate. But when Satan challenges Jesus in the temptation narrative in Matthew chapter 4, the first, he says, if you're really God's son, hey, prove it by doing this. And Yeshua's first response, he's going to quote 3 texts from Deuteronomy, all from Deuteronomy 6 or 8, so all from roughly the same context. But the first response he gives, a person shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from God's mouth. The immediate context of that is God speaking about Israel as his son. So Yeshua goes directly to scripture and takes the model of sonship for Israel as the model for what it means for him to be God's son. He's going to follow that model rather than Satan saying, well, you need to do it this way. So I think it has to do with identification with his people, as well as with the Davidic lineage, more specifically.
Dr. Keener, there's, I think this is a broad question that I'm probably thinking as well for myself. Someone asked, is there a resource that goes over the Sermon on the Mount that you would recommend? This person says that they struggled with the English and American or Western mindset to process what it really means to the Jewish worldview or mindset. And the questioner says, I feel very condemned when I read it and struggle to comprehend what the Lord is saying in certain parts. And I just identify with this person that as we listen to someone as knowledgeable as you and as well as to Dr. Rudolph, and we're uncovering and reclaiming this Jewish understanding of the scripture, it's almost like we start feeling like we didn't really know what it was ever saying. So is there a good resource that you would recommend on starting into an understanding for someone?
Yeah, I mean, my own understanding is articulated in my Matthew commentary. So, and then there's others. Samuel Tobias Locke's has a rabbinic commentary in the Gospels, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's been published since then that I'm not up on all the most recent things. So David may be able to give some more up-to-date comments on that. But in terms of feeling condemned, I mean, it's meant to challenge us, not to condemn us. So when he says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, Yeshua is the only one. I mean, whatever we think be perfect means, be as perfect as your heavenly Father. I mean, that's a call to all of us to go deeper. It's not something anybody actually, because as perfect as our Heavenly Father, I mean, that's a perfect standard. But also the idea keeps on going in chapter 6 about doing things to be seen by your Heavenly Father, not not for others to see. Don't do your religion for others to see, but uh, with kavanah, from the intention of the heart. But also what Yeshua teaches about the kingdom is for those who receive it like a child, Matthew 18. It's something that we embrace. It transforms us from within. It's by Yeshua's work in us. So he's calling us not to depend on um, our own outward righteousness, but to be transformed by the kingdom, and therefore the righteousness flows from that. Matthew, I think, doesn't emphasize that as much, because I think he was already taking for granted that followers of Yeshua know that. I mean, Yeshua came to die for us, to redeem us, to reconcile us to God. That's emphasized more in some other works in the Brit Hadashah. But I think Matthew wants us in the Sermon on the Mount to get the ethics of the kingdom. God doesn't lower the standard. We see the disciples repeatedly falling short of the standard, especially in Mark, but also in Matthew. And the narratives help qualify the teaching, because they show us, okay, Jesus doesn't lower the standard of where the disciples are, but Jesus takes these same disciples who fail the standard, and he says, whoever denies me will be denied before my Father in heaven. In Matthew 26, his chief disciple denies him. His other disciples abandon him. One betrays him, and that's the end of him, but the others abandon him. They fall asleep when he needs them most, even though they probably normally on the night of Pesach stayed up late sharing stories about God's redemption. We may be like them, but the point is, he doesn't lower the standard, but he didn't reject the disciples. He took them where they were at, and he made them into something else. Like Yeshua says to the first ones he calls, I will make you fishers of people. I actually had this in a dream last night, where the Lord was showing me this, that he called nobodies to show that he can call anybody, and that it's he who makes us into what he's called us to be. So it starts with grace, with chesed, his faithful love.
Related to that very issue, a question came in about how Yeshua's teachings compare with respect to traditions regarding the treatment of women, the underrepresented, the outcasts, and whether you had any special points to note about that.
Yeah, oh, that's a big story. In terms of women, now there were a range of different approaches in early Judaism. So Philo and Josephus, both writing in Greek, but writing in the 1st century. Philo is so androcentric, that's a nice way to put it, gynophobic, whatever. Now with the empress, women of elite class, he could make an exception. So he says that the empress was so brilliant, she became almost male in her reasoning powers. Josephus says that he attributes this to the law, even though it's not in the law. Josephus says that the law says that the testimony of a woman should not be accepted because of the levity and temerity of their gender. And he's in practice, he shows himself pretty sexist too, the way he does with his wives, but in succession. The rabbis were more generous. But again, you have a range of approaches among the rabbis. So there's actually one passage where you have these two views side by side, where one rabbi says, any man who teaches his daughter the Torah may as well have taught her to be a prostitute. But another rabbi says, if your wife is short, bend down to hear her whisper. That's really sweet. In terms of, normally women were not trained to be, they weren't trained to be rabbis. You do have Beruria, the wife of Rabbi Meir in the late 2nd century, daughter of a rabbi, wife of a rabbi. She knew, in the earliest sources, at least domestic halakha, backward and forward. But her story is kind of like Yentl, you know, like it wasn't widely received by her male peers. Women, of course, heard the Torah in the synagogue, but they weren't raised normally to recite the Torah and in the way that boys were. So there were advantages for men. Of course, women were exempt from some of the commandments that way too, because they were women minors and those who were mentally challenged. Yeshua has a woman, this isn't in Matthew, but has a woman sitting at his feet. What you have in Abot 1:1, I think it's 1:1, with the rabbi sitting in the disciples sitting in the dust at the feet of their teachers. The only other place where Luke uses that same expression is in Acts 22:3, where Paul, Shaul, sat at the feet of Rabban Gamaliel, the first. So maybe I shouldn't be calling him Rabban, but anyway, Yeshua has Miriam sitting at his feet, learning from him. And he can't send, among the 12, he does have women following him, and that alone could be a cause for scandal. The Pharisees did in the 2nd century BC because they had women supporters. So he is moving in a very progressive direction. He's not going to send out women along with the men on missions. That would really go too far in terms of scandal. But we do see women involved in ministry elsewhere in the New Testament. We see Paul talking about it. And anyway, I'm getting into really controversial stuff now. So probably not a gateway, but just in case you have other viewers. But I think with women prophesying, Huldah, Deborah, and so on, it's a long story. I have a whole book on this, which actually needs to be updated. But anyway, that's the short version.
That's good. This is an interesting one. And I think you touched a little bit on this in your lecture. So someone writes, rabbis often use hyperbole to demonstrate their points. At what point do we interpret Jesus's words as literal and not hyperbole? How do we make that difference?
That is the question. That's where a lot of the debates come in. And legitimate debate. I mean, it's the same thing when you talk about using cultural background. You say, what's cultural? Well, the expression of all of it is cultural, but the point should be transcultural. But what is the point? So where does the cultural background lead? So Paul, 1 Corinthians 13:9, we know in part and we prophesy in part. And so, of course, James, Jacob, 3:1, we teachers will be judged more strictly, but we need some grace because we know in part and prophets prophesy in part. We're not, sometimes there's going to be differences of opinion. We work together if we agree on the essentials, but in terms of discerning what's hyperbole, you look for what the point is that's being expressed in this radical way. So faith to move mountains. Well, neither do the disciples nor probably anybody else. There is a story of Coptic Christians who were being oppressed under a caliphate, I think, and they had to pray for a mountain to be moved or they were all going to be executed. And they prayed and there was a big earthquake and they said, okay, we'll let you live. But for the most part, we don't have stories of people of faith literally moving mountains. But the idea is, if by faith you can move a mountain, well, you can do whatever you need to do. The context was Yeshua. Well, actually, there's two contexts in Matthew. It's Matthew 17 and Matthew 21, I believe. But I'm conflating a couple different things with. I just wrote an article on Mark 11 with that. But Jesus curses a fig tree in Matthew 21 and Mark 11, and the fig tree withers. And Peter's like, whoa, look, did you see what happened? That fig tree withered. By this point in the gospel, he should know, he shouldn't be so surprised, but Yeshua says, okay, oh, you're freaked out about this. Well, I tell you this, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed. Now, mustard seed, I mean, it's like pepper in your hand. If it's black mustard, it's just really small. He says, if you have just that little bit of faith, you can not just curse a fig tree, you cannot just move a fig tree so it's dries up from its roots. You can uproot mountains, which again was a standard hyperbole. Rabbis used it for somebody who would accomplish unbelievable feats of Torah memory. And when Jesus says it just takes a little bit of faith, I think he's saying, because sometimes we say, oh boy, I don't have enough faith. I think he's saying, don't focus on your faith. Focus on the one in whom you don't have faith in your faith. It's not how big your faith is, it's how big is the God in whom is your faith. And you know, like when Peter starts walking on the water in Matthew 14, and then starts looking at the wind and the waves and starts sinking, and Yeshua does call out to Yeshua, that's the right thing to do. But keeping our eyes on him, there's no limit to what can be done. Now, of course, people have taken this the wrong way. I think it's Lamentations 3:37, something like that. Who is the one who speaks and it comes to pass unless the Lord has commanded it? I mean, we should be led by the Spirit. It's not just whatever we say, oh boy, that's so funny, I'm going to die laughing. And then it happens. No, it's not. It has to be Spirit led. But anyway, I talk too much. I'm so sorry. I really am ADHD. That one was not a joke. But.
Dr. Keener, here's a kind of a general question. Who was Matthew? And was he writing to a particular community? And if so, what kind of community do you think it was?
Let me take the latter part first. It's actually a little bit less controversial. In terms of the community, Richard Bauckham, of course, has he edited a book called The Gospels for All Christians. So the idea is that when you're writing a major literary work, not just a letter to somebody, but a foundation document, you're expecting that it's going to go out to a lot of people. You want as many people to see it as possible. So you're looking for a wide circulation. At the same time, even within that book, a couple of the essays, one of by Richard Burridge and some others, point out that you can have hopes for a wide circulation, but you still have a target audience. You know, for me, when I write a book, it's going to determine whether I use footnotes or not, how many footnotes I'm allowed to use, what my page count is allowed to be, and so on. Um, so in terms of where Matthew's target audience is, scholars sometimes differ in terms of location. The majority view is Syria, an urban area in Syria. That makes good sense. Makes good sense that it would be Antioch, like where Ignatius is later from. It makes sense because his audience is familiar not just with Jewish tradition in general. I mean, you read Philo of Alexandria. Philo is very different from the rabbis, for example. Matthew makes a lot more sense from a Judean and Galilean context, or from a Syrian context where the Jewish communities were closer than it would, say, from an Alexandrian context or Corinthian context or whatever. So that makes sense. As for the ethnicity, target ethnicity of the audience, certainly that one I think is clearly Jewish. I think John Meyer, whom I greatly respect, at one point he thought it was Gentile, but I think he changed his mind on that eventually, because it's just so clearly saturated. Now, could there have been some Gentiles among them? Yeah, I mean, there could be, but if they were Gentiles who understood that they had converted to a Jewish faith, which I think was much better understood by believers in the first century than in the second century and later. Well, at least Gentile believers in the second century and later. In terms of who the author was, obviously the author is Jewish. The author, if I'm just going from internal evidence, I could get, was it 1352 or whatever, and talk about a scribe for the kingdom who brings the scribal background, the knowledge of the Torah, together with understanding of the new covenant in the message of the kingdom. The church tradition is very strong. Well, it's also very strong that Matthew wrote first and wrote in Hebrew. Matthew's gospel as we have it doesn't seem to be written in Hebrew, but it did interest me when my friend came up with the arguments for the Hebrew stuff in the genealogy, because Matthew 2:23, he shall be called a Nazarene, seems to work in a play on words where it really helps if you understand Hebrew. And Matthew 27, some of the special Matthean material really seems to work better if it was originally in Hebrew. And also a lot of the sayings material, which would have been preserved more, at least somewhat more carefully, more attention to the style of the teacher. You wouldn't have verbatim memory of, word for word, everything they always said. If you remembered everything Yeshua said, the world itself couldn't contain the books, right? But given the idiom in his sayings, just like Rabbi Tarfon saying about "I bury my sons," that was remembered. I think that "Amen, I say to you," and so on. Even "Son of Man," that makes sense in Aramaic and Hebrew. It makes absolutely no more sense in Greek than it does in English. I'm inclined to think that maybe Matthew did write first, had a collection of sayings which would fit what Papias says in the early second century, and that Matthew or his disciples, once Mark comes out, that's got the imprimatur. That's from, this is the voice of Peter speaking through this. So everybody's going to say, okay, so you don't have to wait, 20 years to say, okay, this is really important work. This is like, she's ready to incorporate that right away. So I do think he used Mark, but I also think we should pay close attention, because when Papias is writing, the later you date the Gospels, the closer they are to Papias. But even at the earliest usual dating of the Gospels, Papias is not writing within living memory of Yeshua's ministry like the Gospels are, but he is writing within living memory of the writing of the Gospels. And that means we should take very seriously his, and he says he listened to people who knew the original disciples, and in a couple cases, he knew the original disciples himself. So I think we need to take all that into account.
Thank you.
Well, that's excellent. Well, we're just bumping up on 3:30 here. We want to be respectful of everyone's time, and that seems like a good place to end. So I just want to note to everyone who's still left with us here, I did put a link in the chat. Hopefully you could all see it, for Dr. Keener's blog and his website, where you can go and peruse his many very updated articles that he's writing. I think you'll find them interesting. I hope that you found this webinar interesting, and we are hoping that you'll join us again tomorrow. I'm sure that will be even more interesting as we discuss the much debated book of Revelation. So I'm looking forward to that. So that will be again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central Time until 3:30 Central. And you can join with the link that you got in your registration that should be coming to you as a reminder tomorrow again as well. So we're really grateful. Thank you again, Dr. Keener, for being with us today. We hope that your weather blows past you without icing over all of your electrical lines and internet lines, so you can join us again tomorrow. So you're not down in the basement cranking a wheel.
Yeah, otherwise I may have to just do audio.
Yeah. So we'll hope for that. And once again, just on behalf of Dr. Rudolph and the TKU Messianic Jewish Studies program, and myself and our team here at the Gateway Center for Israel, want to say thanks for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and God bless you all.
Thank you, Dr. Keener.
Thank you, David. You're still recording.